So today we are joined by Mark A. Pfister. Mark is the CEO and Chief Board Consultant of MA Pfister Strategy Group, an executive management and board consulting firm that serves as strategic advisory council for executives and boards in the public, private and nonprofit sectors. He's chairman and CEO of Integral Board Group and the creator of the Board as a Service engagement model, which is credited with an invention in the industry itself. He's a board director and board consultant, having worked with hundreds of board, public, private, nonprofit organizations as their directors with a focus on strategy, governance, and technology, or particularly around cybersecurity as well. He speaks in over 80 events yearly on his international speaking tours on the topics of strategy, building an effective board for your company, and becoming an exceptional board director candidate. Mark completed his Harvard Business School's executive education program for board of directors. He's an executive master certified board director through the American College of Corporate Directors. He holds certificate in cyber intelligence professional board certification through the McAfee Institute. He publishes monthly in the board director, board advisor, and C-level newsletter, reaching 26,500 businesses, leaders in 70 countries, no less. His book, which I've had the privilege, should I say, of contributing to across the board, The Modern Architecture Behind an Effective Board of Directors, reached Amazon's #1 new release in corporate governance, and is in circulation again in over 70 countries. Mark also served as an engineering office in the US Merchant Marine. So with that behind us, Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ross. Pleasure to be with you, and good to be speaking with you again as well.
Likewise, we've known each other for quite some time. Mark's based in the New York City area, and we came together to work on a project in the startup space where we were looking to raise some capital in an organization and set up a scaling structure for that organization. And we'll get to that during the rest of the course of this discussion. But tell me how you came to be where you're at right now. I mean, your beginnings of your career were very, very different to where you are now, which to say the least is highly specialized. So maybe just take us through that journey, if you would, for our listeners.
Sure. And, at a high level, and this is true of everybody has an interesting story from where they've started and where they've gotten to today. My story from college on really started, I actually chose a military or regimented type college to go to called Maritime, which was in the Merchant Marine realm. So it's similar to getting a dual major. So I came out with my officer license in the engineering side to be able to serve and ship as an officer in the US Merchant Marine, but also came out with a science, technology, engineering-based degree in facilities engineering, which is design and operation of power plants from coal to nuclear fired. Anyway, wow. In that particular space, after graduating college, I started to work more so in the technology realm. And it was very clear to me that although folks in the technology realm were extremely brilliant, they were not always the best managers. They were not always the best leaders. And I noticed a niche area immediately with my background in science, technology, and engineering to add these components and get the leg up on the management and the leadership side. And that led me down the path of leading large scale projects to leading project groups for organizations such as American Express in their technology area. Moving on to starting my own companies that were, again, project-based in the technology realm. But again, always kind of focused on that leadership and the governance and the strategy side to the technology components, which I think today is still a huge niche area. Over the years, that led me into many connections and work with boards of directors. And to this day, I'm a trusted advisor to many boards of directors for exactly that reason, that I can see both sides of the table, from the more tactical components to the very high level governance and strategy areas. And I find that, long story short in all this, I find that being able to work with boards and serve on boards of directors, it really is the epitome of strategy and governance and how to guide a CEO and the overall organization in what we view as successful, but also be willing and open to listen. Many CEOs have great ideas, of course, and I think there's a leadership component of being open and available quite frankly, to hear that input, but take everything that you're listening to, allow for the conversation, ask more questions than you give answers to.
Right.
There's a lot of pieces here that in the technology realm have been either lost or forgotten or never known from the beginning. And I think it's extremely powerful. But to this day, I'm not really focused in one particular industry vertical when it comes to the board space. I work with boards of just about every type of industry or industry vertical out there. And it's been a fun trip, Ross. I mean, it's been interesting, and I feel like I learn every day in this field.
No doubt, no doubt. So when we came together a number of years ago, it's approaching a decade, and I'm certainly a lot grayer than I was back then. But what I had an appreciation for was the structure you need to set up. So we were in an organization where product market fit had been established. There was some kind of existing revenue and market share there, but really, in order to scale, what needed to be put in place would be what I would deem to be the pillars and the foundations, right? So you've got a strategy guy. I was working on the recruitment and the digital marketing side. You've got a sales guy. You've got a HR person. You've got a finance lead, etc. Maybe just share with me some of the success stories, some of the challenges, some of the hurdles to overcome, because I see this all the time in some of the work we do with private equity and venture capital, where you have product market fit and you've got a kind of founder CEO, but then you've got to do a couple things next as a juncture and a decision point, meaning that the founder CEO kind of morphs into a CEO for scale, right? So a Zuckerberg, so someone who's very uncomfortable in, being an extrovert, but has learned and adapted and figured out how to make that happen. Or somebody who says, you know what, I'm not a builder, I'm not a runner, I'm the ideas guy, and I'm happy to sit in the engineering department and churn out code and product all day long and run that team because I'm good at it, but I'm not the public face of it. So maybe just walk me through that journey and how your structures helps enable that process to work.
Sure. Well, what you describe is a common challenge for especially early stage or even high growth companies. And starting out, I'll say that knowing what I know, if I knew back then what I know now, when I started my own companies in the past and led them to my particular exit from two companies, I probably could have done with my co-founders in 4 years what took us 11 years to do, if I indeed had built that team around me, that sounding board, whether it was an advisory group or a board of directors. It probably, I still think to this day, it would have sped up that process greatly, and probably made the journey a little more enjoyable, quite frankly, as part of that process. But the challenges you mentioned, in many cases, a founder or the lead CEO of an organization at the early stages, we have to understand that is their baby. They want to be involved in all the areas. There's likely a good amount of micromanagement that's going on with it, and in some cases, there's ego that plays into this also. So it's very hard for a founder or CEO of an early stage or even a high growth company to let go of those reins a little bit. And that can be whether they're looking to form a board or a board of directors or a board of advisors, if they're looking upward, or if they're looking out across the organization, even to hire strong managers or leaders across that organization that they may view as challenging to them themselves. So there's a lot of dynamic and pieces into this. I will tell you that when founders and leaders of organizations of any size, and also looking at especially of early stage businesses, I first believe, and I'm known for saying this, it's never too early to form this group, this board for your organization. I've always kept my portfolio of clients a range of sizes. Even to this day, right now, I'm working with very early stage startups, all the way to Fortune 50 global organizations in terms of working with their boards or helping the early stage businesses build their boards. And what's interesting, and I get pushback early on, but within a few months, the value is seen, is that the company I mentioned right now that's early stage, a founder and a partner, there are more people on the advisory board right now than they have employees in the organization. And that's not by chance. I pushed for that due to the fact that why should that founder and co-founder make many of the mistakes that the folks that have become the advisory board have already experienced? Let them advise on that and allow these founders to avoid and maneuver around these particular risks and pitfalls early on. Have that group with you early on. So I'm a firm believer of that, and I think it's probably gonna shorten the time frame of reaching that high growth phase for this early stage startup years in advance of what I think that they would reach on their previous trajectory. So focusing on to also answer, I think a part of your question, Ross, is that's in terms of the time frame of forming that group. The other challenge is that most founders and leaders don't realize there is an architecture, a proper way of structuring a board, whether it be a board of advisors or a board of directors. This has been an area of focus for me for many years. My book is on that topic of proper board architecture. And I think it's been a highly overlooked area for many years, and this is true of any entity of business, meaning nonprofit, private, or public organization. They view it as, I'm going to find the right person, and pretty soon they're going to be on my board. But what about all the other considerations of expertise, operations knowledge, what committees they're going to specifically serve on the board, balancing personality types on the board to make sure we don't have all type A, or I look for a balance of what I view as my four main personality types of analyst, diplomat, sentinel, and explorer, right? Those are important areas to make sure that when you're deliberating or debating something, that you get all different types of viewpoints of diversity, right? Diversity of thought, leaving diversity of perspective. All these things play into the formation of a proper board. And most folks are not aware that there is a proper way to do this. It's more so, I'm going to approach this person because they've been successful in the past, or they have a skill set that I need, right? That's just scratching the surface of a very monolithic approach in their minds of how to form a proper board.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And now, actually, you've kind of preempted one of my next questions was, is there a size in terms of where this is appropriate? And you've dealt with that very extensively. And I suppose, what changes do you see happen? And also, I'm curious to know is the willingness and the open-mindedness, right? So you've got to be open and willing to listen. I've seen a lot of family businesses in my time go different directions, and not always the right one, because of this kind of mentality of we've got to own, we've got to maintain control and all that kind of stuff. And I've seen some other ones go in the right direction where they've taken a step back and go, we may not have all the answers here. So I'm keen to know and drill in on that a small bit as well. But maybe take us through some of the kind of structures you've put in place and the kind of key pivot points that made. Like, that was day one, and then what happened in day 90 and many years out into the future. Just take us through those
Sure.
personalities and that journey, if you would.
Sure. Well, I think the first step in all of this is making sure that you are selecting folks that are intellectually curious, I'll say, right?
Okay.
When you have that curiosity, it forces you to ask questions. You want to know more things, and as we all know, the more you learn, it's the less you know, right? Because you're asking the right questions. You find out that maybe that's not an expertise area of yours, and you want to find people that can fill those gaps for you. So the personality type of someone who is looking to build a board from scratch, which I think is what you're alluding to, is extremely important to have that right personality and to match that personality with board members or board advisors that are similar in that approach. It's not about forcing your way. It's not about forcing ideas or concepts, or if you feel like you have to call something out and then force a vote on it, that's not really what this group is for. And many boards, when you talk about family organizations, these boards may or may not have voting rights, meaning that they may or may not be fiduciaries when it comes down to giving advice versus voting for that to be implemented, or for that idea to be implemented. So there's different models with it. I like to think, I try to break through all that minutia of the fiduciary or voting responsibility areas and say, is it a group of people that you would want to work with, right? Yeah. Where you don't have to call a specific type of authority to push through something that you want. So that's the first piece of this. I want to make sure I'm answering your question. So I think the second part of your question had to do with, well, let me ask you the second part of your question again. I think it had to do with the founder themselves actually knowing when to look and what to ask. I think it was in terms of
right.
forming
some of the differences that's made, the structure and the differences that have brought forth to the org thereafter.
Sure. Well, the first thing to mention on this is that I believe that when the proper structure is implemented, it works for early stage startups to, again, Fortune 50 global companies. So you don't have to take a different approach when it comes to how you would think about the structure or the architecture of your board. Now, in saying that, you may be looking for different skill sets or different experience areas. A prime example of this is matching the growth stage of a board director or board advisor for your organization, specifically for the stage of growth you're going to be in. So it wouldn't make sense for an early stage startup that wants to enter a high growth phase to have a board made up of all Fortune 50 or Fortune 200 public company board directors, right? It's not that they don't have the experience, but their recent experience has been more so in a much larger company, and it's already at the IPO and the public standpoint. They're not really, maybe don't have the experience that someone will be looking for at the early seed growth and then maturity phases that many high growth companies are looking for. So to me, it's extremely important to look for all these different facets. My book, again, talks about these areas of how you can take this thought process or this methodology and right size that for your particular organization, and maybe look at not only the current growth phase you're going through, but having folks around you that have the next 1 or 2 steps of growth phase, so you can get some of that longevity and the history of that person to help you pass through those different phases.
Okay, that makes sense. And one of the things I'm very curious about, and you mentioned there about putting structures in place around voting rights, which is hugely interesting, because I think a lot of the reluctance I've seen is when people have a baby as such, and they're like, I don't want to give up my baby and give up control, etc. So maybe just take us through what's board as a service, and how did you come up with that, and what sort of does it mean for orgs in terms of taking that I suppose reluctance off the table, and then ultimately benefiting them and removing that risk, if you could share it with us.
Sure. Well, the company where I do my consulting through is MA Pfister Strategy Group. That's my speaking, my certification, my education arm of my particular work. The company you're speaking of is Integral Board Group. That was a model that was designed for to kind of chip away a little bit at the PE and the VC world, quite frankly. So I always hated the fact that you had to, as a business owner, debate and come to conclusion on the question of, are you willing, in order to take in money and to get the advisory group around you, whether it be debt financing or equity type of financing you're looking for, that you had to immediately make the decision on giving up, quite frankly, voting rights and equity in your business. So the model of a board as a service is a different approach. It allows a business owner to say, you know what, I don't have to give up equity and I don't have to give up voting rights if I bring in a board as a service model and I get everything I need. It's a ready built and for hire board of directors operating as a board of advisors to that organization. So you have the skill sets of board of directors, but they're not voting fiduciary members of the organization unless that particular founder wants that in the future. Yep. We can convert that agreement over, but we never wanted to force that decision early on for an organization or a founder to say, you know what, I have to right at this moment make the decision on giving up voting rights, a portion of voting rights and a portion of equity in my business. You don't even have a track record of success as of yet, and yet you're being asked to give up portions of the baby that you've cultivated over maybe months or years.
Right.
So it allows even an early stage company to have that truly savvy group around them that they should have, and it's been built out in the methodology I'm talking about. So it is a full-fledged board in terms of skill set and balance of personality types, without forcing some of these major decisions at an early stage for a founder.
So we work with organizations and portfolio companies all the time. We work with public companies as well. And the public companies I find are, yes, they're more bureaucratic. There's a lot more kind of paperwork to do when you onboard them, all that kind of stuff. But they're very tightly run ships. They know what they're doing. They're very well funded, and they execute like crazy. We also work with folks who are kind of seed, Series A through D, where they're still learning on the job, right? They've established product market fit and they're going through that journey, and they're failing and failing fast and succeeding as well, and that's all part of the process. And that's one of the things I love about the US is failure is encouraged, it's celebrated, because you know what you not to do, right? As Edison said. So I'm curious to know, what are the major gaps? So let's take the example of raising capital. We were involved in a startup together, you and I. So what do you feel like, in the broad experience you have, is the biggest challenge folks face when they maybe have product market fit established, they have some capital in whatever stage that's at? Like, what are the biggest challenges you see organizations across the industries that you work in actually scaling? And maybe they're not looking to go public, maybe they are, but getting to that level where they're in that fortune category you mentioned as well. What are the big challenges there, Mark?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be a little selfish on this, and I'm going to point to the support team that's around that person in a moment. But let me first say that part of the assumption here, I'm assuming, is that a company is fairly established. Their proof of concept is done. They have a viable product, and they have potentially a client base. At that point, I can tell you if I'm going to invest in a company, I am keenly aware of who are the people that founder or group of founders have surrounded themselves with. So if I take the terminology of board or board of directors or board of advisors, and just go and say to myself, okay, I want to know the people that are advising these founders. It's not possible to do this on your own anymore, I believe. You have to have people around you with different levels of experience, whether it be growth phases, as I mentioned, around an organization, or phases they're hoping to achieve and going to achieve shortly. There are many nuances in that and experiences needed around those areas. So what I particularly want to look for are the team that is supporting in some way the founders or the leaders of that organization. Now, if it's to the point where it is called a board, or it's a formal board of directors or a formal board of advisors, even better, because I know that there's probably some level of structure to that. Right. Hopefully it's the level of structure that I'd be looking for, as being a purist in the board director form, sure. and looking for the highest level of passion and involvement from a board of directors. But saying that, I think that due diligence goes a long way, looking in from the outside as a potential investor, because number one is I know the level of resilience of that organization based on the type of people that founder or founders have surrounded themselves with, number one. Number two is that group actually brings clout. Again, a board or a group of advisors, that group brings clout. In my book, you may remember a portion of a chapter where I talk about an early stage company I was working with. Helped them build out initially their board of advisors, and then we transferred those folks in a period of 2 years to the board of directors. And when the founder did not want to go down the path of equity type growth, meaning giving up equity for investment, they decided to do some debt investment or debt equity type of format, and went to a banking group they had worked with for many years, both personally and through other companies they had founded. Long story short on this, and I was so impressed by the loan officer. The loan officer said that to the founder, things are looking good, but we want to meet the advisory group that you've assigned and are working with your company. And I thought it was brilliant, because it hit me at that point. And again, I wrote about this in my book, that loan officer wanted to understand more in depth about how the advisors that this person had surrounded themselves with were going to advise on how to spend the money that this loan officer was taking that risk on or going to approve. Right. So there's a clout component to this also, whether it be at a client level or even a way of generating capital for an organization. I thought it was brilliant and worth writing about, because who knows if that debt type of growth infusion of capital would have worked, or if it would have been approved, if it wasn't for the group that person was surrounding themselves with. The bank was basically trying to lower their risk, and it's what they did.
That makes a ton of sense. And it's interesting. It kind of brings me on to my next point of interest, which is around the network piece. So, and I know when you and I were talking about the piece in your book that I contributed to, it was very much twofold around network. number one. So, you know, in my father's generation, it was all about who you knew, you know, and I know so and so, and they'll look after you. And it was kind of like a gentleman's thing, tip your cap time type of stuff. And that still exists today. There's no question. But it's also about what you know as well. And I also think it's about a personal brand. So I think in the book we talk about, you know, the locker room and who you know at the country club and all that sort of stuff. And that's still out there. That's still true. But you've also got to have this public facing, media savvy, social component to this, that you're talking about your perpetual brand. I often get on conversations with folks where they're asking what I call the FAQs, right? And I'm like, go watch this video, go read this post I wrote. And then we can talk again about it. It's almost like I've done that. My homework is out in the ether for the world to see. And also, if you want to talk below the line, here are folks I know that can validate I'm a good guy and I get the job done and I execute like crazy. Where do you see that today? I mean, what do you see in terms of that being vital component, and how are folks carrying that into their kind of public life today?
Sure. There's a few things I think of immediately with this, and just to compare to a nonprofit for a moment as a starting foundation point, and then moving into private and public responses to your question. One is that I actually think for many nonprofit organizations, they are board members are joined in those organizations because of what they themselves can bring to the organization in terms of money, right? So it's the you can be a board member if you cut X number of checks per year to the organization, and you know, it's almost like you're buying the seat, quite frankly.
Interesting, yeah.
It sets a lot of the wrong example. I again write frequently about this, that when I talk about a board member bringing something to the table, I like to think about that not necessarily as the ability to give or get, as they say in the nonprofit world, right? Give themselves funding or get the funding. I like to think it more of them, the board member bringing the strategy and the governance acumen to that particular board. And you know, if you find those right people, they also bring the clout and they also bring the network. Now, when I think about a network, when I use that word network, I'm talking about a network that solves and solutions problems and issues, right? Where it gets tricky, meaning that they have the network of expertise they can reach out to. If they themselves don't know the answer to it, they can reach out to 10 individuals they've worked with over the years, their network,
Right.
and find the answer and get an average of that answer across many different industries potentially. That's the best value of the clout or the network that a board
Couldn't agree more.
brings. All right. Now, for organizations, I think you're alluding to, whether it's you know, again, a startup or a private organization that is mainly looking at those board members to be assigned because they know that those folks are going to bring in either their own funding or they're going to go and get the funding. That to me sets a whole wrong precedent in many cases if it's not structured properly.
Sure.
As part of what their multiple responsibilities are. It just doesn't create the right relationship, and it makes many of the board members' interaction more financial update meetings than oversight of governance and strategy of the organization. So I'm not saying it's not valuable to have that, but it shouldn't be the main driving point to have a board member come on board because they're going to raise funding in some way for you, right? Unless, of course, it's one person and they are the chair of the development committee, which is responsible for that, then so be it. I'm a little more open to that. But if your entire board is built around the structure that each one of those members is in a give or get type of scenario, or they were only assigned because they're an investor, that's the beginning of the end for effective board directorship.
Okay. Yeah. No. I can see why that would be the case. And I'm also curious to know, because we do a lot of work. There's two types of hires. I feel there's the plug and play, and then there's the step up, right? So for us, particularly in very, very defined niches or niches, they are very, very difficult to find a C-level candidate for that has actually done this, because maybe the product's unique, the go-to-market's unique, it's a different play. So in order to fill that position, you need to be a step up candidate. So you're somebody who has related and transferable skills. You've maybe been at the VP level and you're about to take that step up, but you can do the job because the teams you're managing are much, much bigger than the challenge you're about to go into. But hey, do you know what? Now you have a C in front of your name in your title, and you're like, I'm not equipped for this. I haven't practiced. There was no course I took along the way. So, how do you help people to make that transition to become, I suppose, fluent in the language of the board speak when you're obviously now at a level where you've got to have reporting responsibilities? Maybe there's fiduciary compliance issues as well. Like, there's a lot to take on board when you make that transition, but it has to be done. What does that look like in your world for your experience, and how do you help?
Sure. So, as you know, one of the main components of responsibility for a board of directors is to select the correct and the right CEO for the organization, right?
Yeah.
So, and that is a huge task. I can tell you that many of the boards I work with, even in the public space, they are just simply not prepared for this. Meaning that it's not an ongoing topic of conversation or even having a trajectory of ongoing focus in those particular areas. Some boards are caught off guard when, say, a CEO, whether it be from their own decisioning to retire or to resign, or because of some other issue that's come up, they're forced to retire or resign. It leaves many of these boards in a tailspin because they have an opening and a gap, and they have nobody, for the most part, in the pipeline that's a viable candidate for this. Saying all of that, a board has to be focused very closely and on a recurring basis on what exactly that succession planning process is,
Mm.
and what is their responsibility towards that, towards making that decision. Saying all that, there is a big challenge today with what I view as gaps in folks that have maybe previous C-level titles and what I particularly view as a great CEO. And today it's a balance of everything from using the correct type of authority, charismatic authority, not titled authority or other types of authority uh, based on your background or the authority you've been given because of the title, right? There's a lot of issues with that today. Having the right EQ, emotional intelligence, and mindfulness intelligence, MQ. How are they communicating? How are they leading? It's a much different world today with the level of transparency into boards as well as into the leadership of organizations
Sure.
because of activist investors. You have proxy advisory services such as Glass Lewis and ISS that are infinitely focused on drilling down into what's happening at the board level and giving their advice and their input to see if that board will actually implement these areas. There's a lot of transparency in these spaces today, so it's much more public, I'll say, especially in the public sector for this decision making. Now, to me, the one of the easiest things I think about in somebody making that transition from any level into the board space, quite frankly, there's a lot of folks that are not at the C level right now, haven't reached the C level, or had a chance to serve in a C level capacity that are becoming board members. And I'm a huge fan of that because I think many boards are too heavily focused on C level makeup, quite frankly. They need a little more diversity in their thought and their background. And keeping a balance of that. Again, I talk about this in my book in terms of the architecture, looking at a little more diversity in that skill set, background, and makeup of board directors. So I'm looking for folks that are very easily able to take off that tactical hat and put on their governance and strategy hat.
Okay.
It's a much different world. I can vet these people out, Ross, in a matter of 3 to 5 minutes. And if I'm building out a nominating committee process and then getting involved in the vetting process, when nominating committees actually handle those pieces, I can tell within 3 to 5 minutes if this person, just by throwing them alternating questions, a very tactical question, and seeing if they drive me back to more governance and strategy type focus in their answer, and then switching over to very high level strategy and governance focus, right? There's tricks in doing that to see if that person is always driving the conversation back. You don't want that tactical level person driving your boardroom discussions down to that level. You get nothing done, you get stuck in the minutia. Right. So that ability to stay at that higher level and at what they say the nose is in, fingers out type of approach is extremely important. There are some folks that are just not cut out for that, right? Even in the transition, if we compare this back to private, maybe early stage organizations, when I'm working with those founders or the CEO of a company of that size, I have to do a little bit of deprogramming and then reprogramming first to make sure that person understands about what the difference is in the types of questions they're asking or where they're infusing themselves in the organization or even in the board meeting. And immediately cut off the discussion and say that's for an outside committee meeting or it's more of a tactical thing for operation, right? We want to make sure that we elevate this and keep it up at this level right now. I think the biggest shock in everything I'm saying, to answer your question, Ross, is that you can take a meeting, a board meeting that in some cases would last for 8 hours and have a lot more success and a lot more viability of the outcomes of that meeting, and in some cases bring it down to 3 or 4 hours instead of an 8-hour meeting by avoiding some of those more tactical pieces that have no space in the boardroom, nor should even a C-level executive or a board level officer be bringing the conversation to that level in the boardroom.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I've seen meeting descend into tactical day-to-day operations, which is absolutely not the point of a governance meeting at that level.
That's right.
Everybody should be bringing high-level feedback and interaction to the meeting. And I often remember the quote that intelligence is not a measurement of retention and regurgitation of knowledge, rather it is the ability to process and summarize that knowledge and apply it practically. And that's the way I very much view it.
Perfect. Absolutely.
So let's say I'm that person who has transitioned from being maybe an individual contributor or somebody who's in the weeds. I'm put on the strategy hat. I've gone in, I've been able to communicate to the board. Yeah, and I know when we've talked previously, there's two kind of avenues you can go from there. You can just be somebody who would use a program like yours to become board certified and speak board language, as it were, because you've no interest in being on the board, but you have to interact with them, right? Communicate on a regular basis. Or, you become that strategic person, you're on the board then suddenly, and you got a taste for it now, and you might like it. How can you maybe make a career of being on a board? I mean, for me, I see that as being innately attractive. And I know plenty of people who would be career board advisors, and they would fly off all over the planet to attend board meetings. And, their wives go with them and they make a trip of it, and they might sit on, 30 boards, quite frankly. What does that look like as a career, Mark?
Sure. Well, first off, I will tell you that what you're describing to me, I'm smiling as you say it, because to me, that is just the epitome of where, for me at least, that's what I'm doing now. And that's, above and beyond just the sitting on the board capacity, I actually find fun talking about it and teaching about it and
Sure.
speaking about it and doing my consulting work. I think the board realm is fascinating, quite frankly. And every board is very different.
Sure.
Saying all that, whether you are an aspiring director today or an experienced director, one of the biggest misses for folks and on either end of the spectrum of this is that they don't understand you have to be packaged properly for this. Prime example of this is that, and it's one of my easiest ways of vetting, quite frankly, if I'm getting folks that are applying for board positions for clients that I'm working with or for my organizations, you have to package yourself differently. So even that first interaction before it's in face-to-face interaction, what are you sending me in terms of your documentation? If you send me a resume or CV formatted document, I already know that you don't have the background and you're not a real board director because you don't send that, right? A CV or a resume forces you to look more like management rather than governance and leadership material. So there's a specific format called a board document, which I teach in depth as part of my program. And it drives all of the pertinent input to be structured in a proper way to show you as leadership, governance, and strategy material, right? You want to be viewed as that. And the toughest thing that most people don't realize is the toughest thing is getting to that first interview. If you can get to the first interview, it's yours to win and it's yours to lose. But remember this too, there are thousands and thousands of what are called board-ready individuals out there, right? They are willing and able and have the background and the knowledge potentially to serve as a highly successful board director. But they will never get the chance to do it because they're not making the right first impression in the way they package themselves, or They're not aware of, even if they make it to that first interview, they're not aware of how to position themselves, or even in the questions that they ask, right? Viewing this as a two-way street. It's not just do everything right to get the answer of yes, we're going to offer you the position, and then you say yes to it, right? This is a choreographed dance of understanding it's a right fit from both sides. And if I don't get the feeling that a board candidate is dancing correctly in that process, I already know that they are probably not versed enough to understand the types of questions they should be asking me, which means if they get the board seat, they're not going to be asking the right questions of the board or the CEO once they're in that position. So the key to this is viewing board directorship as a discipline, not a hobby. And in doing so, there's work to do in this, right? There's work to get across your leadership style intermixed with your experience. There's work in getting what I call part of your career trifecta, right? So think of three edges of the triangle. You have your expertise, which is what you know. You have your experience, which is how you've applied it. And then you have this last area over here that many people miss, and I call it your proof area, right? What is the background, the education, the certification that shows that you have furthered your education in modern day board directorship, modern day board director packaging to represent yourself properly? What is the balance of that career trifecta to show me that you view this as a disciplined position, not just, I'm going to see if I can land the seat and see how it goes?
Yeah, and that's a key point I think that you've mentioned there as well, and that very much comes back to the personality piece, the willingness, the application, etc. Like, what sort of commitment is required? And I would imagine that it's different across different boards, but as a typical board director, like what does your calendar look like? How often does the board meet? Like what does that commitment level look like, and what does, like, there's no one size fits all, but maybe talk to us a bit about like what they bring in terms of that commitment level and the output expected at each board member level.
Sure. Well, I'm going to first say, and some may find this surprising, that I'm going to first go down and talk at the lowest level and talk about the time commitment, right? So I will tell you that I have never seen a truly successful board director put in less than 250 hours per year for the organization they're serving. And that is consistent across nonprofit, private, and public organizations. It is just not possible. And the problem with this is that most board directors, many board directors, come into it thinking that it's going to be nowhere near that time commitment. So, and that's a problem. Number one, if the person sitting next to you, if you're committed to put in your 250 hours per year, right, and the person next to you is thinking they're going to put in 50 hours a year as a board director, you're already creating an environment of animosity that is going to rear its head at some point in that board, because the person that's putting in the time is going to be light years ahead and much more productive than the person that's claiming they're going to put in or thinking they're going to put in 50 hours a year for that position, right? So that's the starting point, and I can't stress that enough. That number, Ross, increased even more over the course of our time in dealing with COVID. Right. I can tell you that board directors that were on more than 4, 5, 6 boards during that time frame, they were absent board directors for many of these increased needed time frames that they had to put in, right? They were serving on 6, maybe 6 boards. There's not enough time in the day. If you double, let's just say that most board directors spent double the amount of time during the past year to deal with COVID issues, right? Which was experienced across many organizations. Of course, start to add up that time, right? 300, 400 hours a year as a board director, and you're sitting on 6 boards. It's not possible to be effective on any of those boards if that's the case. Or you have to pick and choose the ones you're going to dedicate the majority of your time to, and then what happens? The other ones suffer. So this terminology, by the way, rolls up into what's called overboarding if you're sitting on too many boards. And you're starting to see a bigger pushback right now, whether you are a CEO of an organization and you want to sit on other boards. Some boards of that organization are saying, we don't want you on any other boards. We need you 100% focused here, or we're going to limit you to only one other board to sit on during this time frame, and that's it, right? Make you sign for that. Some boards will say that we are going to heavily weigh if you're on more than 2 other boards right now. We may not be interested in you because we don't think you can dedicate the amount of time that's required for this, right? So that concept of overboarding is a direct fit into the decisioning process right now of what it takes to be a board director and how you're going to be evaluated. I know I look for that. The first thing I'm looking for is how many boards is this person sitting on? If it's too many and they're not going to be present, I don't want to deal with that. I need them when I need them.
That's a great answer.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
that makes a ton of sense.
So that to me is one of the big commitment areas. Now, I hate to associate effectiveness and efficiency with time, but if you just look at the amount of material that has to be read, whether you're a fast reader or a slow reader, you're in for hours and hours of reading material and preparation and research, quite frankly, on competitors and other things and what's happening in your industry to be able to give the right type of input in a board meeting. That alone is a significant amount of time.
Sure.
So it's not just the board meeting is to talk about things that are in some cases are coming to a vote, and you may want to give your last bit of information on that. But all of the other work is outside the boardroom, right? Through the committee and your own reading and your own investigative work, I like to call it. So that's one area. The other thing, again, I talked about the packaging component and the dedication in the boardroom. And let me, Ross, bring this full circle and come back to this packaging component. So just because a board says that they're looking for a specific type of expertise, that doesn't mean that you only come in as the one-trick pony and only talk about that expertise area. Your packaging should be in a way that I teach and that I show in my program, which is you should have your major and you should have 3 minors. Your major is what you do and what your expertise and your experience is in, whatever that industry area. Many times that correlates back to an industry titled area, right? Perfect. Now, the folks that only focus on that, I say to myself, I need more depth. I need more knowledge. I need somebody who can do more things than just bring that one expertise area to my boards, either my boards or the boards I'm helping to architect and build. So I look at what's next. I call my 3 minors. Tell me up front the 3 commonly associated board committees that you are valuable in at varying levels. I understand that some of them you may not be able to serve as the chair on that particular committee area, but you are a valuable and viable member to serve on that particular committee. So for me right now, I can tell you my 3 minors are the following: strategy, governance, and technology, plus the cybersecurity part in technology. So you can very easily correlate those back to common board committees, right? Strategy or strategic planning committee, governance committee, that may even be rolled in with the nominating committee, right? Or the compensation or remuneration committee, right? And then technology, some boards have a technology committee, some don't. Some are looking for that input on someone who brings a background of cybersecurity, whether there's a committee or not, doesn't matter. So you're not just coming in as that one-trick pony. I want depth. It goes back to a prime area of one of the 3 areas of architecture for a board, which is your coverage and balance, where that person coming in has depth of knowledge across multiple areas that are valuable to the board. And that's another thing to look at in terms of how you're packaging yourself.
Yeah, very valid point. And just as we wrap up here, Mark, you touched on COVID, and we've had prior conversations before where we talked about COVID, and we just mentioned it now in relation to boards being stretched because they're putting in more time, and it's crisis management mode, right? It's getting stuck into, we're in a space that's impacted by this, and it's a global phenomenon. But I'm a big believer in that, that brings forth opportunity as well. And the nature of the conversation we had previously was that COVID actually had allowed us to rethink, or given us that kind of moment to reflect on rethinking, well, actually, borders don't matter as much today, and we can actually increase the diversity on our board from an international perspective. Particularly in a lot of work we do is taking US-based companies and helping them to establish a presence in Europe, and Ireland is well known for that. We have a track record of that, and we had the IDA on the show quite recently as well. But maybe talk to us about kind of some of the benefits that this rethink has brought, and what diversity that brings forth going forward as well, if you would.
Sure. And maybe I can expand on this a little bit with higher level comments, but there was an article I wrote some months ago called the 7 Pivots for the COVID Age Board. You can find this on my LinkedIn profile where it was reposted, but the high level areas for this that I noticed almost immediately and of course became more solidified as the pandemic went on. One was that many boards were not just there for strategic and governance support anymore. They were actually acting as an emotional support arm for the C-level and the CEOs of their organizations,
Wow.
because
Hey.
the CEOs were just overwhelmed with what I called their simultaneity, that the amount of things happening at the same time that were challenging. Boards all of a sudden had to put on their consoling hats and their support hats, emotional support hats at the same time. So many boards, again, were not prepared for that. And I don't think they identified it early on, which is why I'm looking for, as part of my in the packaging program I do, as well as the vetting processes for nominating committees, I want to know that somebody brings in their personality a component of empathy and emotional intelligence and mindfulness intelligence to support that. The boards that were able to identify this early on and just see the stress that these CEOs were under, especially in the early phases when their workforce was going remote, when prior to that they weren't allowed to work remote, or just it wasn't part of company policy. So that's one area that's this emotional support arm was highly noticeable. Time allocations for executives and boards went through the roof. We talked about this a moment ago, and it really brought out this search now for our people in our organization overboarded, whether they're C-level or board directors serving the company. Transparency, right? So boards went through a phase of really having to be much more transparent, above and beyond what even these activist investors in the past or the proxy advisory services were looking to do. Boards really became somewhat of the public viewpoint of these organizations because they were working so closely, and in some cases doing some of the press releases or some of the interviews. So it's quite an interesting time frame for that. Risk and scenario planning became huge, right? It was overlooked. The board should be doing these things. They weren't. The boards that were doing this were much more prepared for an event like COVID. No board that I worked with actually had already worked out something that was pandemic related, right? But the ones that had planned out for risk in their organizations through their risk and scenario planning at the board level were much more prepared. So another area of focus and noticeable focus. Few last ones on this, Ross. Forced digital transformation. All of these projects that were extremely expensive and highly complex. The board had pushed these off for a while. They knew of them. They weren't pushing the CEO to do these things. And then all of a sudden, they not only had to do these digital transformation projects on the network side or the SaaS or those areas on the network side, they had to do it for their entire workforce to allow them to work from home, right? Yes. So just extremely, more added pressure. And, two last ones. The political conversations got extremely heated during many of these particular meetings because COVID itself across the globe was highly politicized. Where did it come from? How is it being treated? Are lockdowns more of a political thing versus a protection thing? So it really diverted many of these boards down rabbit holes that were just not productive. So readdressing those and pointing them towards a different direction was highly important. And then effectively and efficiently collaborating. So I talk about board portals mainly when I talk about this collaboration and communication, right? So how are you getting your board to communicate? All of a sudden they're remote, their board meetings are remote, their committee meetings are remote. How are we ensuring that they are still effective? Another major area of focus of change for these boards during that time frame.
Yeah, I think I've seen all of those play out myself, and in particularly the digital transformation piece has been huge. A lot of the work we would do is with orgs who facilitate that happening, and they're seeing crazy growth, like 60% year on year. In some cases they're doing more revenue January through June than they did the prior year. It's just nuts. But I think you're seeing that particularly in the mid-market and the SMB, and even some departments in the IP, in the public space, where they're like, we didn't think about that being from home, but now we actually need to do that. It was super old school. That's been phenomenally educational today. I really appreciate it, Mark. So if folks want to hear more and learn more about you, where can they go?
Sure, easiest way, where everything, the books, the programs, the recorded webinars, they can go to pfisterstrategy.com. My last name is spelled a little strange. It's Pfister strategy.com. and you'll find everything we discussed there today, including links to articles on these topics.
Fantastic. Appreciate it. I'm sure our listeners will go check it out and enjoy every moment. Thanks again, Mark, and we look forward to having you again on the show for sure.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, Ross.